coffee and comics, guys, are two favorite things to do. We're here to talk about one of the seminal works of the 1980s. This is Frank Miller's second run on Daredevil from 1986. It's a storyline that's been collected as Daredevil Born Again. It's available in hardcover, softcover, everything. So I have read this several times, and I can say I do think this absolutely holds up today. And at the time this was published, Frank Miller was probably the only writer that could sort of compete with Alan Moore at the time. This is your first time reading it. What's your impression of it now, 30 years later?
I would agree that the last two chapters just seem weird and more like a Captain America story than a Daredevil one. And but I would disagree. I don't feel like it's that good.
The way this story starts out is that Matt Murdock's girlfriend from the 1960s comes back as a heroin addict, decides that the only way to get her next fix is to sell Daredevil's secret identity to the Kingpin. This is a fascinating, inciting incident, especially for a Silver Age character.
Well, she doesn't actually sell it to the Kingpin. She sells it to some Mexican drug dealer, who then he goes on to sell it. And the Kingpin is like, okay, I need to test this information and also kill everyone who's ever come in contact with anyone who's known this. Because Kingpin wants to be the only person that knows Matt Murdock is Daredevil. And it seemed like if he really wanted to destroy Daredevil, he wouldn't have done that. He would have exposed his identity instead of just poking at him with like a sharp stick almost.
I think to me it just shows how methodical he thinks and how... he could have just killed him. The second he got the envelope, he could have just killed him, but instead he decided to torture him over the course of time hopefully without Daredevil realizing who was doing it.
Right, but of course I think it's the last page of the second chapter where Matt Murdock's apartment blows up. He's like, okay. And then it seems like, I don't know how he figures this out. He sort of just pulls it out of thin air almost.
He's a lawyer.
He's a lawyer, but there's been no evidence to support the fact that Kingpin is the one that did this. He's sort of just like, he picks up his costume, he's like, oh, it's Kingpin.
Well, no, because he says nothing about it up until now said gangster. But now that you've blown up my apartment, now I know it's a gangster. It's got to be the Kingpin.
I suppose.
And the thing is, as a longtime reader, it'd be like if you're reading a Bruce Wayne story, and then all of a sudden something like that happens, you go, "It's the Joker." I think that's what it was.
Okay, yeah.
It's sort of like there's a little bit of jumping in without explaining, because again, it was a monthly comic, so they're assuming you're already reading Daredevil. I think that's one of the weaknesses, maybe. But for me, especially the early chapters, especially chapter 2, which is the first Daredevil comic I ever read, when Matt Murdock gets put in that taxi and gets sent to the bottom of the Hudson, and Kingpin's narrating and explaining what they did, and then the camera or the viewer zooming into this shot of this taxi at the bottom of the river, and then there's like the cops found the car and they pulled it out, but
there's no corpse.
There was no corpse, and Kingpin's like, there was no corpse, and he's like, now he's got to deal with them. Now Matt's going to come back for him. But the thing I like about this is, especially considering the time it came out, to me there was really nothing like this as far as the experimental storytelling, where there was a lot of splash pages that are filled with narration of other things that are going on, referencing things that have happened. At the time, that wasn't a really common thing.
Right, and in that mindset, like as if I was reading this when it came out, I can see, that's definitely an amazing feat. But I don't know, I felt like the story was disconnected. I felt like it did jump around too much in narration. And I don't know, I felt like the Kingpin came off very strong in the first issue. But then after the second issue, he just almost fell apart, and he could have just not been there. Like, he disappeared from the story.
But don't forget, he's also the one that sent the nurse after Ben Urich. He continued to do more things to Daredevil after the first chapter, don't forget, so he still was active.
I know, but I just feel like they came off that first chapter with such a bang, and then everything that followed, it didn't live up to that. It came out of the gate very strong. That first issue was really good, but then after that, it just sort of dwindled down until I feel like Frank Miller, he had his idea and he executed it, but then he didn't know where to go with it.
Here's the thing. One thing I think we have to keep in mind is this was a monthly comic, and the last two chapters, even though they're collected as part of Born Again Today, in the original collection, these were not included. Right. So the funny thing is not only were these not included, there was an additional 2 issues that were supposed to be drawn by Walt Simonson that were never released. So even though we're reading it as a complete story, it's actually 7 issues of a monthly comic. So I think it's more like this was probably just the beginning of what could have been a much longer storyline. So maybe if you would have planned it as, okay, I know I'm going to start it here and end it here, the ending would have been much better. And even if you were to end it 3 issues earlier, where you have him fighting the guy dressed up as Daredevil, even that was a little bit hokey, I thought. That was a little bit unnecessary.
Yeah, definitely. I would completely agree. It's just, it had a strange feeling where it had the hokey elements that preceded this comic, Frank Miller's run.
Sure.
But then it also tried to go with a more mature route, and I just felt like the two don't mesh.
Briefly, I will also say David Mazzucchelli's art, again, groundbreaking for the day. There was nothing else like it.
Yeah.
So many artists have followed in his footsteps now. Michael Lark, Alex Maleev, Michael Lark. Anyway, what did you think of the art?
Oh, that, hands down, that's one of the things that just kept me reading, is that the panels were so well laid out and drawn and layered. Each panel had a sense of depth to it. It didn't really feel like I was looking at a two-dimensional image. It like had like a camera angle kind of aesthetic and a sense of depth to what I was looking at. It was really nice.
This story, for me, is what made me a lifelong Daredevil fan. I still love Daredevil, and it's all because of this. I do think it holds up. I still give it a 9 out of 10. You, as a reader today, what would you give it out of 10?
I would, you know, it is good, but it just kind of wasn't for me.
Okay.
But I can see its worth.
Sure.
So I would give it more like a 7, 7.5. You know, I personally didn't like it so much, but it is a good story nonetheless.
So, Daredevil Born Again, maybe not the place to start with Daredevil, but definitely one of the most important chapters in Daredevil's history. So, if you get a chance, pick this up with a 9 out of 10 rating for me and a 7 out of 10 rating for Max. Thanks a lot, Max.
No problem.